This is an oral history interview with Mr. Coral Windsor Barnes in his home on February 23, 1982. The interviewer is Susan Gortner. Mr. Barnes, when we first talked, we discussed a general history of your life, and this time I'd like to ask you some questions about the changes you've seen. First of all, let's go back and talk about the farms a little. They've changed a lot from small farms. What was it like, and how big were the farms when you were growing up?
Of course, as you know, my time back to the early 1900s, before World War I was even dreamed about. And in my very earliest years of recollection, we did not live on a farm until I was approximately 9 years old. But the average size of farm then would be perhaps somewhere between 80 and 120 acres, I suspect, with many families raising a flock of children on an 80 acres in which they were renters, and that way got only half of the income from their work. And many of those hardy families were able to save enough money for their retirement years out of a setup like that. And that very much continued until the tremendous effects of the World War I began to show. But when we started farming in approximately 1909, I think it cost Dad in the neighborhood of $500 to start up as a tenant. $500. We had 4 or 5 horses and very minimal implements. A walking plow, which my dad used a lot and which I never really did, would probably cost $25. And the farming methods, farming knowledge, the great organization like the Farm Bureau, for example, had not been organized until 20 years after that. It came out of the World War I upheaval. And a certain amount of scientific approaches to farming began to develop. Gradually the agricultural colleges developed. In my early days, it was considered that anybody who was going to be a farmer was certainly wasting time and money to go to college, because anybody you didn't have to have an education beyond reading and writing and adding up, so they weren't cheating you at the elevator when you sold your grain, were about all you were thought to need. But the agricultural colleges then gradually developed, and they not only brought out and gradually got to the attention of farm people that there was a science of farming and that there were all sorts of angles of improving agriculture, and they gradually began to urge the young people on the farm, especially boys, of course, to come and take some courses. They used to, in the early days of this movement, have what they call farm institutes, and progressive farmers would gather maybe for a few days of institute in which a great deal of information would be put out. And so the the farm changes gradually came as a result of, well, as I've said, the World War I opened up the horizons of people to the place where they realized they were not just living in one little township and farming one little farm, but they were part of a great, vast world. So it was really a revolution that took place. But along with that revolution that came as a result of World War I and resulted in my little community of 500 even organizing a high school to which I started at the age of 19. It caused the well, it just brought so many developments that opened up people's individual horizons and national horizons, and resulted in a gradual increase in the thinking of farming, and instead of being just a way of life and making a living and having a wholesome place to raise your children, it gradually became a business. But the same boom that started with World War I developed partly because of the economic upheaval of the times. Prices went booming way up and got people all enthused, but then suddenly those prices, because of the queer twists of the law of supply and demand in a free society, suddenly those prices just went to nothing. Corn went down in about a 10-year period from as high as, well, I don't know that corn ever got to $4 a bushel, but wheat did. Corn must have gotten up to as much as $3. And 12 or 14 years later, in the midst of the depression, corn got down to 10 cents a bushel. Well, the boom and the new growth that was spawned as a result of World War I underwent a very depressing period known as the Great Depression. And that was a real setback because it just got to the place where farmers couldn't compete in a business-like world with a free market system. And that, of course, resulted in such things as the development of Farm Bureau and co-op enterprises where the farmer could get his voice, they could get their voices together to have some power, and the universities, ag schools did a lot too in that direction that helped us survive, and it was just barely survival, the Depression. And oddly enough and sadly enough, we didn't come really out of it until another world war came along to throw things out of balance again. So the whole history of farming has been a process of evolution greatly affected by the beginnings and endings of wars. These two, the World War I, World War II, enveloping practically the whole world, and resulted to some degree, was responsible to some degree for our being forced to become aware of world economies instead of just national and local economies where everybody made his living and made things do. But then what had started with World War I and then had gone into a period of dormancy, more or less, in which farmers just hung on, there came the Second World War, and as a result of that, and following that, there came great increases in invention of machines such as the combine and the corn picker and the monstrous things that we have now, making it much easier on the farmer to get his work done, and enabling him to operate a bigger farm because of bigger and better machinery. But it also had the negative effect of putting great numbers of farm hands, as we used to call them, farm workers, out of jobs, because a farmer could take his great big machine and run a great big farm and do it with a son and maybe the wife. Lots of wives now drive a truck and haul grain all the time. So that upset the employment situation in our country, and we're still trying to cope with that, still fighting the problems. Right now it's acute, problems of unemployment in general. And it resulted in the small farmer, and especially the inefficient small farmer, being just gradually forced out of business. He couldn't cope. Well, of course, that threw a heavier weight on the employment situation in the cities, because those men flocked to the towns and the cities as they were squeezed out of the only thing they knew how to do, farming. They went to the factories and so on, and that increased the unemployment situation there. So farming in our free society has been very much at the base, a very fundamental part of our economic system. But because it tries to retain its freedom, it has had many ups and downs because of the cutthroat competition of all the other activities in the society. So that now we have, well, a good example of what has happened in this whole process that keeps going is the fact that International Harvester Company, which was the pillar of farm implements and big and wealthy and had it made, are on the verge of bankruptcy right now. And farmers who are farming 10 times as much land as they used to farm, 10 or 12 times more, are crying about just barely making it go. And the people who devise implements and manufacture and sell them have reached a stage which I compare it to the dinosaur age. The dinosaurs, if you have ever read anything about, they at one time were in our environment, but they got so big and so overdone that they commenced to mire down, and they died out. Well, I think that farm machinery has those who think ahead, the pace setters in the field of farm machinery, have brought us to something of a dinosaur stage. I think that farmers are going to have to come down and quit thinking in terms of $100,000 combines. Because a big combine, like a big dinosaur, isn't very useful only a short time of the year. And the rest of the time He just sits and depreciates and wastes the farmer's assets. So I would, in my old-fashioned thinking, predict that there's going to be an about face on the size. I don't believe farms are going to continue to increase in size, and I don't believe they're going to continue. Farmers are not going to continue being dupes for a salesman, making them think that they have to have that great big monstrous machine to run their farm with. I may be wrong on this because it could go the other way, and that has an element in it that is worse, and that is the development and the extension of the development of corporation farms, in which the family farm and the wholesome life of the country are gone completely, and a big corporation will own and operate the farms and hire the farm workers wherever they can't get along without them, just as you would any other worker in a factory or job in a corporation. And that would mean a great change in the whole concept of agriculture. And unfortunately, to dream of going back to the good old days is kind of an empty dream, not much but a dream. But if we continue to go on in the headlong direction we've been going, it doesn't seem that farms in the sense that farming in the sense that we knew it in 1910 has any chance of ever existing again, unless we have an atomic war or some Holocaust or catastrophe that brings us to our knees and we start over again. And I am not about to set that up as a desirable goal in any sense of the word.
Do you remember your reaction to the first cars and tractors, and what did people think of them?
That's a good question. I might answer that by that first impression idea. An old-time story about an old fellow who lived back in the woods and was strictly a son of the soil. And he'd never heard of a steam engine even. This would have been even before my day. Somebody had one some ways off running a sawmill. And they talked this old boy into going over and seeing it. They're going to make a believer out of him. Well, they got there, and the steam engine was just sitting there. They hadn't fired it up yet. And but they got busy, and they threw fuel in the firebox and commenced to get up the steam. Great big iron thing. They'll never get her started. Never get her started. Well, pretty soon it got up to full steam, opened the throttle, and away she went. They'll never get her stopped. That was the type of attitude that you had when automobiles first came in. There was actually a law in Illinois in the very early days. I don't know that I can prove this, but I just know it was true. I don't think it was on the books very long. But one of the early problems of the automobile as they commenced to get out onto the road chugging along was they scared the horses. Horses and buggies going by, and there'd be lots of runaways, which were very common in the days of horses and buggies. Horses would get excited and start running, and you couldn't hold them, and you'd have wrecks. Well, there was for a short time on the books in the state of Illinois a law that said if you were driving along in your automobile, you didn't carry insurance in those days, and the word liability wasn't in the picture at all, that you should stop. You should carry with you a tarp of some kind, pull off the side of the road, you should stop and put that tarp over and cover that and stay there until that horse got past. Well, that was too ridiculous to even repeat here, but it makes a good story. In the first place, when the automobiles came in, they weren't very practical out in the country because they required better surfaces to run on properly. The first ones had solid tires, so that you didn't have to pump up tires. They're solid rubber tires. They were more or less gas buggies. You might say a buggy fashioned after the buggy that you pulled with a horse. Only they had a little motor and a little, some guy, Henry Ford and others, knew how to put gears together and how to make a gasoline, make cylinders and make a spark explode the gas in there and get some power that didn't come from horses or mules. There's a story told about the old hillbilly that saw his first, you know what the old interurban was? Mm-hmm. He saw the first one of those go through, and no horses, no mules, no anything pushing it at all. And his answer was, no fire, no smoking, no pushing, no pulling, but she goes like hell, they all the same. But the coming of the automobile had as much effect, caused as much upheaval in the society as did the world wars that came and went. But it was a gradual development. I saw my first car, auto, if you could call it that, motor vehicle, probably when I was 5 or 6 years old, maybe 4 years old. And it wasn't much more than a buggy with no top on it and high wheels and a 2-cylinder motor that would chug, chug, chug along. And the people who were a little bit daring and had a little bit of money to play around with would buy one. And gradually in our little town by I think it was in 1907, when Mayor Gandy of our little town came by our house in his new Ford touring car. And it had a cloth top, very much like a buggy or a surrey, big straps running from the front and top part down to the top of the fenders. And if you went 20 miles an hour, oh man, that was really something. You would just think that was just out of this world. And then came the problem of, in the summertime, dry roads, just pure dirt, and the dust, actually the silt dust. This was after cars commenced to use the roads fairly frequently. And if a farm wife was hanging out her clothes, somebody would go along, 2 or 3 of them in their cars at 25 or 30 miles an hour. They'd kick up a dust that wouldn't settle down for 5 or 6 minutes, just a cloud of dust. You couldn't even see anything. And then, of course, in the bad weather, there came the problem of freezing radiators and mud, and just undesirable conditions for operating the car. So they weren't very practical for a while. We didn't have our first Ford, which I think cost $360, until 1916. People had gradually gotten them. We were tenant farmers, and not too ready to take up with every newfangled thing that came along. But we bought one then. I would suspect that many people of the vintage of my grandmother, for example, who died I think in 1923 and 24, and my grandfather Barnes died in 1917, they had never ridden autos. Many people, older people, were afraid of them, instruments of the devil. They just didn't trust them at all. So the effect of the auto came on slowly. It caught on rather slowly in the rural areas, but there again, the general opening up that came as a result of World War I caused the people to be more, more forward-looking, more ready to accept new ideas, and more gradually interested in going faster. Of course, the mechanized experiences of the war would, airplanes were used a little bit in World War I think, but it wasn't, they weren't a major force. But the coming of the auto and the perfecting of it to the extent, along with the development of roads, that enabled you to go considerable distance. You could run over to Decatur or Springfield and get back all in one day. Well, now you can do it all in 1 hour if you have to. But that caused an awakening of the society, and of course it caused it gave young people more freedom. Probably was the beginning of the more promiscuous sexual activity that is so common now. You could get away from everything, just the two of you together in a car. And as time went by, they were perfected enough that you could be sheltered from the weather and be a cozy little home on wheels, so to speak. So it would be impossible for me, with my limited brain, to assess the real impact of the coming of the automobile. But it was one of those things that made had tremendous effect in moving society forward and opening up, you don't have to have too much imagination to realize that the people traveling hither and yon, and the circle of acquaintances would, you might have had in our little town, just a few hundred people. It would be your whole circle of friends and acquaintances, because you didn't get more than a few miles from home. And the automobile just took us gradually into all parts of the whole country, so that the effect on society would be difficult to really measure. But it was one of the things that had a great, an exceedingly great effect on the development of civilization.
How do you think the railroads affected farm life, trade for the farmers, and did you ever ride on the Interurban, and what was it like?
What was your first?
How the railroads affected farm life.
When I was, the year I was born, our little town was without a railroad at all. It's a good place to start on that kind of question. And it came through in 1901. Our town was built on a hill, and the railroad, because of the difficulty of going up over a hill in comparison with going down the foot of the hill, the railroad went probably a quarter to a half a mile from where the center of the village was when I was born, down in the flat ground. And of course, within 15 or 20 years, the whole business section, what there was of it, moved down to that area near the railroad. So that had a real impact. And then, of course, in the days before railroads, any isolated area like we lived in, it would be necessary for you to drive your herd of cattle or haul them in wagons to a distant market at Springfield or someplace. And the same way with your grain. So, and that, of course, was connected with this small farm bit. You would use most of what you raised on that farm, sort of a self-sustaining unit, and there was no way of marketing grain. So the railroads had another effect. Of course, the railroads came through generally, I suppose, in this country by 1830 or 40. But many isolated communities like ours didn't have a railroad line through it. And an accident of history, I was born in an area like that. But when you think of the Southern Pacific Railroad that was developed and opened up there after the Civil War, you've seen it in pictures, haven't you, where the East and West came together, and
right.
That greatly enhanced the development of our whole vast western section of our country, and was a major factor in our becoming a large world power instead of just a frontier country, backwoods country, which we had been. But I, of course, was not affected so much by the railroad as I was by the automobile, because it was right in your own home. My first ride on a railroad and train was when I was about 7 years old. For 5 cents, 5 cents each, my brother and I, who was a little older than I was, rode from our little town to the next little town where an aunt lived. And for a dime, we got that trip on that train. And I haven't ridden trains very much in my whole lifetime, because we didn't go into place when I was quite young. We stayed at home. And then by the time I was big enough to go places, the automobile had become developed, and you could jump in that, and for a little bit of 15 cent a gallon gasoline, you could go quite a little ways in an old Ford. And on a train you had to dig out cash to pay. So as the automobile developed, I guess you would say, for the improvement of transportation and gradually hauling, at the local level, the railroad did it for the long range, tying the very distant parts of the country together. And then, of course, the automobile had been going along pretty strong for 20 years before trucks started really coming in. They first called them a little car with a commercial body. Well, it wasn't anything but a pickup truck, but that term hadn't come in yet. And I remember in 1926, some lady saying something about, she was trying to show off a little, cover up the fact that they were riding around in a truck. She said something about a Ford, I guess it was, with a commercial body. And I thought, what is a commercial body? And I was 25, 6 years old. And I didn't know what she meant. Well, all she meant was a truck, but she didn't want to admit that they were driving a truck. So those things, it just boggles the mind when you go to try to put into words the effect that it had in all ways. Then, of course, when trucks came in, that was the beginning of the downfall of the railroads. It took a long time, the railroads were cock of the walk in long-distance hauling until, well, probably 30 or 40 years ago, because the early trucks were pretty crude, and the vast network of roads that we have now, highways, and on which the trucks could run, had not been developed. That took billions of dollars of money, and incidentally, the railroads throughout history, from the very beginning, were subsidized by government, and they still own, the railroad companies still own vast areas of land on their right-of-ways that were originally given to them by the government, especially in the western states, in the process of developing the western states. So now we see the railroads on the ropes, practically bankrupt, and the trucking has become at times something almost of a racket, but a tremendously big business and a great boon to the people in the matter of enabling them to have a standard of living which included all sorts of things in all seasons of the year, because trucks come and go constantly. Of course, the railroads could do that too, but the trucks pull right up to your door, or pull up in your street and block the whole street while you unload in the store, and you've got stuff that was grown in California and Florida that just gets here in no time. So our whole standard of living has been just boomed from both the developments of the motor vehicle on the highways and the railroads. It's been an amazing development.
What recollections do you have of the interurban? Did you ever ride on it?
Yes. In 1925, I think I rode from Decatur through Springfield to Carlinville and played a basketball game down there. And I rode up in the front end of the thing, and I was scared all the way because they go around those curves in some of the places where the roads curve some. But my experience with them and with railroads in general has been very limited. I hesitate to mention the worst part of the interurban, but Roby's only sister was killed by an interurban 5 miles south of town here, and the first month we lived in Monticello, we got caught with that freight train going through Monticello, and all 4 of us in the car, and they wrecked the car completely, but it was a thing that, I shouldn't get into this. It ground the car up, but it wasn't any great big impact because the thing was going through town and was going relatively slowly, but it was so heavy and big that we came out with only a crushed toe on the oldest boy's big toe. So that leaves us a little bit reluctant and hesitant to talk about the interurban. But it served a great purpose. Interurban means intercity, you know. And it would stop at that crossing that I just mentioned. They could go there, and if they were standing there, they'd stop and pick them up, take them to Decatur. Back before
that down on Marion Street, was that the crossing?
No, the one where this terrible accident came was just north of the Beament Cemetery.
Oh, but I was thinking of your accident.
Well, it was right down here by Hubbard's, before Hubbard's built that plumbing shop of theirs in there, between the Republican office that was all open in there, and there was a carnival. That's how it happened. And so it came right down Livingston Street and curved on to Market Street and on out down past the Beeman Cemetery. But as you know, those interurban lines now have been, in this area at least, they're practically all defunct. They were part of the railroad system, really, only they were electric powered instead of steam, and therefore were limited to areas where electricity was easily available. So they died a more sudden death than the railroads are, for that matter. But they also played a great part for a period of probably 25 years in the development and improvement of the transportation and convenience of travel of the people, all of which contributed to making us a more open society and much less provincial.
Speaking of changes in society, what are your memories of Prohibition?
Well, it just happened that my this is another little bit of the history that's in our book, but largely because of the fact that my grandfather and his brothers, according to the stories they told when we were boys, when I was little, drank and gambled away 320 acres of land in the, this would have been in Mount Auburn Township in Christian County, considerably before I was born. And my grandfather, Barnes, he died when I was 17 years old, was a result of that drinking and gambling, and as a result he wasn't the kind of grandfather that we could be very proud of. But my father, and I don't know whether he ever was involved with boozing or not, and of course booze was common certainly in those days, not in the same sense that it is now. But my father was a churchman from as long as I can remember. Superintendent of the Sunday school for 27 years in a row, and very much against booze. And I grew up without ever being tempted. To this day, I won't, if I know that there's something with liquor in it, I will dodge it if it's at a reception. I may have to take a few sips, whatnot, and I don't ever make any show of it. But when Prohibition came along, even though it turned out to be quite a fiasco, we were for it. I wasn't old enough to vote yet, of course. I was only 17. I hadn't come 18 yet. But my father voted the Prohibition ticket for years instead of voting for the Democrats or Republicans. It was partly the fact that he was a dry, but partly the fact that he couldn't stomach either of the major parties, and so he cast a protest vote practically all of his years. The development of the automobile hadn't reached far enough by 1918 that drunkenness on the highways was anyways near the problem that it later became. And unfortunately, in the minds of an awful lot of people, if you went to church, you shouldn't drink, and if you drank, you shouldn't go to church. That's simplifying it too much. And there was an anti-temperance league, WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was dead set against booze, and they were pretty extreme on it. I can recall in the days before Prohibition, when boozing was a problem. There was no question. It always has been and always will be. But some old lady in our church had some pledges to be signed. Sign the pledge that you would never, and so forth. Well, for some reason or other, I wouldn't sign one of those pledges at all as a 15 or 16-year-old. Though I was not, in my family background, I was very much opposed to the liquor thing, and we welcomed the 18th Amendment, the Volstead Act. But it didn't take too long to establish that people wanted their liquor and they were going to have it. And the Prohibition law was impossible to enforce properly. Many of the drinkers were people who had been, men who had been in World War I and hadn't got back yet when this vote was put over. And they sort of, a lot of them, there was a feeling stirred up that it would never have passed had they been here and been able to vote. And so there was not a great deal of enthusiasm, to say the least, on the part of young America to support that law. And so it was violated all over the place. Became a joke, really. And did you ever hear of Al Capone? Mm-hmm. Well, a great many people feel that Al Capone and his ilk, his type, would never have developed, never have got into the gangster thing and the successful gangster operations that had it not been for the Prohibition law. There is some reason to believe that that is true. And the farce of trying to enforce it when most of the policemen and the sheriffs and the lawmakers liked their booze a little bit anyway. There was lots of hypocrisy involved in the thing. And the fact that there were many, many families, especially among working people and uneducated people, whose lives were ruined by the fact that Dad was an old drunkard and the saloons were the only place he could go to feel comfortable and use up all the family resources and all that. But then, of course, after 15 years of that hypocrisy, when Roosevelt came in, one of the first things he did was to have that act repealed, and we've been wide open on liquor ever since. It probably did speed up the development of racketeering and underworld crime. I'm not sure, but you see, it came in right at the end of World War I when things had been, everybody was pretty much on the ball and trying to get the war over and worried about the boys coming home. Well, here they came, and along with it, the Prohibition law had come in, and the celebrators, even on Armistice Day, who wanted to hoop it up because of the joy of having the war over and all those things, they just couldn't take it without some booze so the thing started off, never got off the ground really when it comes to its effectiveness. It was a noble attempt to head off something which is really a curse to our country and to all nations, but it did not succeed. And so things were opened up, and we've spent millions and millions and billions of dollars trying to control the liquor traffic, trying to cut down on the number of highway deaths. So it costs, it takes a heavy toll, but as people who were in favor of prohibition and people who have always been dry, we've always been in the minority, really. I think, actually. Now, of course, in the many of the modern churches, the mainline churches, they don't take drinking in moderation as any great sin at all. And you'd have to say that that's probably true. But the thing that always bothers me is the down and out Skid Row type, and the 10 million alcoholics that we have in our country wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for the booze. And so, from that standpoint, the prohibition was a good thing. But practically, if people won't go along with it, it doesn't have a chance of success. And I don't know the answer now, but it's pitiful. The amount of liquor that's consumed, and I'm sure that in high places in our government, great many of our very serious decisions are made by people under the influence of booze. Because they drink. Some of these congressmen, men, they can't stand the present life without some kind of an anesthetic. And booze serves as that. And of course it's got into women and children now and gone on into the drug thing. So it's a whole big story in itself.